Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to my lecture. This is part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 12, Food Production and the Environment. We left off in part 1 talking about GMOs, those genetically modified organisms or genetically modified foods. So now we're going to move on. We talked also about the green revolutions in part 1, the first and the second green revolution. Well, most of the green revolution and genetically engineered crop varieties, unfortunately, require large inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water. So again, these are more of that industrialized farming that we talked about, the high input industrialized farming, and it's often too expensive for many farmers to actually do. So in addition, we're finding out that the yields that are produced are actually no higher with these genetically engineered crops than those of traditional strains. So while we thought by creating these genetically engineered crops we would get bigger yields, we're really not seeing the yields become that much greater. But what we are seeing is the increase in the inputs that we have to put in to grow these genetically engineered crop varieties. So again, while we thought this was going to be the saving grace for us, we're now finding out years later that this maybe isn't this industrialized agriculture maybe isn't the way to go. However, organic farming does have some drawbacks that we need to talk about. Again, an organic farming would be more of that low input traditional farming. The potential problems is that you can leach some nitrates into the groundwater from composted manure. Again, they use manure as fertilizer, so that could leach some pollution down into the groundwater. In addition, large scale composting actually generates greenhouse gases, so that increases the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Some organic farmers resort to plowing to control weeds, but unfortunately that plowing leads to soil erosion and loss of soil nutrients, and an organic non-till system has been developed. A non-till system is one that you do not have to plow, because again, plowing does lead to some soil erosion, and we'll talk about some of the ways to get around that in just a couple of slides. With that being said, we should still try to expand our organic agriculture because there are benefits to organic farming. It builds soil organic matter, so it actually helps increase the fertility of the soil. It actually reduces erosion and water pollution compared to the high input industrialized farming. We use organic farming does use less fossil fuel energy, so you do cut the greenhouse gas emissions. Again, the previous slide showed some of the drawbacks, but again, those drawbacks are minimal compared to the drawbacks from the industrialized farming. It actually matches the conventional yields, so you actually can get the same amount of food. Organic agriculture can be more weed tolerant. We'll talk about why in a bit. Crops compare favorably in years of drought, and actually it could become more profitable. All right, so let's talk about industrialized meat production now, and now how that harms the environment. So again, industrialized meat production is what I showed you with all those cows, all that cattle combined into that space, right? They're all in there feeding, and then they get slaughtered. The pros of this industrialized meat production is the increase in meat supply, right? I showed you that chart that showed in U.S. and in China how the meat supply has gone up, as well as the consumption. It reduces overgrazing, because in the industrialized meat production, you have the cattle. They're not out in the rangelands grazing on their own. They're just being fed feed in basically a little spot. So it does reduce overgrazing, and it keeps food prices down, because again, you have all this industrialized meat being produced. The cons: uses large amounts of water to irrigate the grain crops that you need to feed the animals. So while the animals aren't out feeding themselves, all right, that helps with reducing overgrazing. You have to feed the animals, and so you need to come up with these grain crops like corn and like wheat and things like that to feed the animals, and so you need large amounts of water to irrigate those crops. Livestock wastes pollute the waterways, so you can imagine that picture I showed you in part 1 with all those cattle. Obviously, the cattle are producing waste that pollutes waterways. And again, we talked about how any of these industrialized, either agriculture, meat, or the aquaculture uses large amounts of energy. And that's why we call them high input industrialized agriculture and industrialized meat production. So again, here are your trade-offs: feedlots and CAFOs. What are CAFOs? Those are confined animal feeding operations. So again, your advantages and disadvantages, once again, definitely have a general idea of these. The advantages: increased meat production, higher profits, less land use, reduce the overgrazing, reduces soil erosion, and protects biodiversity, right? Because you don't have these animals out there destroying rangelands and grasslands. Disadvantages: animals are unnaturally confined and crowded. Large inputs of grain, fish meal, water, and fossil fuels are needed. Greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide and methane emissions, are large. Concentration of animal waste, again, pollutes the water, and the use of antibiotics can increase genetic resistance to microbes in humans. So the antibiotics used for the cattle can actually increase genetic resistance to microbes in human beings. All right, aquaculture now. How can they harm aquatic ecosystems? So you'll notice how this chapter went. We first talked about the three types of food production. Now we're talking about what those three types, how they harm the environment. And now the next, as we go through the rest of this part 2, we'll begin talking about how can we more sustainably do these three types of food production. But first, let's talk about aquaculture and how it can harm aquatic ecosystems. We do have several environmental problems with aquaculture. First, fish are caught to use as feed on these fish farms. So that actually contributes to the depletion of the wild fish, because so you got to catch wild fish to feed the fish in your aquaculture fish farms, right? So now you're obviously depleting the wild fish even more. And there are environmental toxins, again, that get into the fish. That's that biomagnification we talked about. And this is why, for instance, salmon, not supposed to eat a lot of salmon because of the higher mercury content. Pesticides and antibiotics on fish farms are a source of pollution, and they can destroy or degrade many of those mangrove forests we talked about, because that's where a lot of these aquaculture farms are created, in the shallow areas near the coastline. And so you're just destroying those wetlands, those mangrove forests. So once again, here we go. Trade-offs, advantages, disadvantages of aquaculture. Basically know these, okay? High efficiency, the aquaculture, meaning you're going to get a lot of fish. High yield, reduces over-harvesting of the fisheries, and jobs and profits. Disadvantages: large inputs of land, grain, and fish meal needed. There's a lot of waste output, loss of those mangrove forests and estuaries as you create these fish farms near the shoreline, and dense populations vulnerable to disease. What does that mean? Well, in these fish farms, you can see here, let me go back. All right, you have this way. You have these fish in these confined little areas. If some disease happens to get on one of the fish or to one of the fish, then obviously the population, because they're so tightly packed, are vulnerable to that disease, and that could obviously kill a lot of the fish that you were thinking of selling. So that could be an issue. All right, so now we're going to move on and talk about how we can do these three types of food production more environmentally sustainably. So how can we protect crops from pests more sustainably? Well, we can sharply cut pesticides use without decreasing crop yield by using a mix of cultivation techniques, biological pest controls, and small amounts of selected chemical pesticides as a last resort. And this is something called Integrated Pest Management, IPM, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides. But basically, what are we talking about here with pests? Well, nature controls the population of most pests. I really do enjoy these next couple of slides, because it really shows you how important nature is, and how, as humans, we try to mimic nature with a lot of these pesticides, but unfortunately, nature just does better by its own. So we're going to talk about that. So pests interfere with human welfare, but natural enemies control pest populations: predators, parasites, disease organisms. They're in the natural ecosystem, and they are free ecosystem services that the planet provides, right? We provide pest control, right? Because think about it. You got these insects, right? Birds, frogs, other things will eat those pests. Parasites, disease could get into those pests and could kill them. So Humans, though, have decided with that green revolution we talked about to produce synthetic pesticides. So they can help control the pest population. What are synthetic pesticides? Where they are chemicals that we create that are used to kill or control pests. They include insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Biopesticides are produced by plants to ward off insects and herbivores. So that's actually a biopesticide is a chemical that's naturally produced. Okay, so synthetic pesticides we produce. Biopesticides are naturally produced. And again, we want to try to look at more of those naturally produced pesticides rather than the synthetic ones that we are creating. So we did have a first generation of pesticides way back when we started the Green Revolution in the early 1900s, and we borrowed those from plants. The second generation of pesticides were lab produced. This is something like DDT, for instance, that is now banned. But the second generation were produced in labs. Also, they have broad spectrum agents. These are pesticides that are a broad spectrum, meaning they kill a lot of different pests, but unfortunately, they can also be toxic to beneficial species that you may want on your farm because, again, it's a broad spectrum. So now we've come up with some narrow spectrum pesticide agents, which, again, just target individual pests. That's a little bit better, and then persistence varies with these. So that's something we need to think about. So what are the benefits of synthetic pesticides? Of course, there's always two sides to the story here. So human lives were saved from malaria because of synthetic pesticides back in the early 1900s. There was a lot of malaria in our tropical forests. Well, you put those pesticides in there, kill those mosquitoes that carry the malaria, and so human lives were saved. It increases food supplies and reduces food loss, so it does do that. It helps control erosion and building soil fertility by avoiding plowing. You don't have to plow as much when you're using synthetic pesticides. It helps farmers reduce costs, and newer pest control methods are safer and more effective than the ones we have had previously. But you'll notice that was one page, right? You notice here, guys, benefits of synthetic pesticides, one page. Now we have problems with synthetic pesticides, 4 pages. We're going to talk about the problems, okay, with these synthetic pesticides. So first off, they accelerate the development of genetic resistance in pests. We're going to talk about that more in a couple of slides. But basically, pests, because those are selected species, are going to reproduce very rapidly. And so you actually very quickly get organisms that are resistant to the pesticide. They are expensive for farmers. Again, in some ways they save cost, but in other ways they're expensive because you have to buy the chemical pesticides to put on your crops. Some insecticides kill the natural predators or parasites that help control pests. Again, we talked about that. They cause environmental pollution. They harm wildlife. And they are also hazards to human health as well, some of these synthetic pesticides. So, once again, trade-offs, advantages, disadvantages of your synthetic pesticides. Once again, you see this chart. Definitely understand what's going on each side of the chart. So advantages, expanding the food supply, raising profits, it works fast, and are safe if used properly. Disadvantages, promote that genetic resistance, can kill pests' natural enemies and harm wildlife and people, can pollute the air, water, and land, and again, they're expensive for farmers. So while they raise the profits, you need more capital money to input initially with the synthetic pesticides because they're expensive, and so that could be a disadvantage. So this is talking about how they become resistant, or these pests become resistant to the insecticides, and I think this is really interesting. So what you have here is we have a corn crop, right? Corn stalk here, and we have these pests on the corn crop, corn stalk, and we put some synthetic chemically produced pesticide on this crop to kill these pests. Most of the pests die. However, 1 or 2, because of a mutation in their genes, survives, right? It is genetically resistant to this synthetic pesticide. So now you have this one guy who's alive. Well, then this one guy obviously finds another mate, and they mate really rapidly and form another bunch of pests on the crop. So now you got to spray the crop again. So now you spray the crop again. The the animals, the pests die, but not all of them die because this guy over here put some genetic resistance, right, his mutation into the population. So now you have, while a bunch of them did die, you had a bunch of them now live, right, because they are resistant to the synthetic pesticide. Well, now these guys are going to mate. We do the same thing again. One or two pests may die, but now more are going to be resistant to the pesticide. And now you have a synthetic pesticide that doesn't work because now the pests have become genetically resistant through natural selection, through mutations to that pesticide. So, and because pests are mostly insects, are selected and reproduce very, very rapidly, you actually get this this phenomena to occur rather quickly, that you get these insects that are resistant to the pesticides because they go through so many generations. It doesn't take that long to then deal with pests that are resistant to the synthetic pesticide you're putting on them, and now you have to go find another synthetic pesticide. So it really doesn't work as well, these synthetic pesticides, as you think they would, because of natural selection and evolution. So, what can you do to help with this synthetic pesticide issue? Well, you can reduce exposure to pesticides. So, you want to grow some of your food using organic methods. You want to buy certified organic food at the grocery store. You want to wash and scrub all fresh fruit and vegetables. You want to eat less meat, no meat, or certified organically produced meat. And before cooking, you want to trim the fat from the meat as well. That can help you reduce your exposure to some of these synthetic pesticides. Now, here are some numbers to think about. Pesticide use has not consistently reduced U.S. crop losses to pests. From 1942 to 1997, crop losses from insects increased from 7% to 13%, even with a 10-time increase in pesticide use. Think about that. We're using 10 times the more pesticides, but the crop losses from those insect pests actually increased 6%, right? From 7 to 13%. So it shows us that these synthetic pesticides do not work. 2014 study, no increase in soybean crop yields for crops treated with the three controversial neonicotinoids, which are just another type of pesticide. And the pesticide industry obviously disputes those findings, but it really showed no increase in yield by using these pesticides. So, we have to get rid of them, right? We have to at least minimize the amount of synthetic pesticides that are being used. So laws and treaties can help protect the U.S. from the harmful effects of pesticides. So the U.S. federal agencies and laws, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, USDA, the FDA, okay, they have laws that help with this. The Fungicide and Rodenticide Act of 1947 helped reduce harmful effects of pesticides, along with the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996. So definitely understand a few of these laws and treaties. Federal laws regulating pesticides use, however, inadequate, and poorly enforced, as a lot of these environmental laws are. The U.S. exports many banned pesticides. So actually poisons can be transmitted in the atmosphere. So the U.S. actually exports a lot of these banned pesticides around the world. So there are alternatives to synthetic pesticides. So the first is biological control, natural predators and parasites. So again, you got to go back to our evolution unit a couple of weeks ago when we spoke about that. But think about you have insects, right? And you have a predator that is attacking the insects. Well, as the insects mutate and change, right, what happens to the predator? It's called coevolution, right? The predator is going to mutate and change to be able to attack and to eat that pest the best, right? So while synthetic pesticides are just chemicals we create, they don't evolve with the pest. Natural predators and natural parasites co-evolve with the pest. So as the pest evolves, the predator evolves. Pest evolves, predator evolves, and therefore there's always that predator or parasite to feed on that pest. So that's a biological control that we're finding out works just as well or even better than synthetic pesticides. Pheromones and hormones can actually do that as well. You can spray those on. Those are natural chemicals, right, that come off of animals. Ecological control, you can use plant diversity to provide habitats for predators of pest species. So this is why the monoculture doesn't work as well as the polyculture, because with the monoculture, you're just going to have one type of crop. So you're not going to get diversity of other type of creatures living in the crop that could maybe help with pest control. You plant a lot of different crops, that polyculture, well, now you have that plant diversity to provide the diversity for the predators of the pest species. So now you get more of them, and now you got more of these predators attacking the pests that you want to control. Cultivation control, this is to vary crops and adjust planting times. That can also help. That's also an alternative to the synthetic pesticide. So IPM, that's that integrated pest management we spoke about. This is a component of a more sustainable agriculture. So again, what is integrated pest management, IPM? This is a program in which each crop and its pests are evaluated as part of an ecosystem. The goal is to minimize the use of synthetic pesticides. So if you look at the pests, each crop, how they're dealing with the ecosystem, you could potentially get the pest natural predators in there to then help control the pests, and this way you can use less synthetic pesticide. Now, the disadvantages of IPM, it does require expert knowledge that people are just now beginning to acquire. So this may be something you can do. Maybe you're going to be part of an integrated pest management company. That could be something that you do down the road, but it is going to require expert knowledge. Methods applied in one area may not apply in another. So that's very interesting. While synthetic pesticides, right, they'll work everywhere for a period of time. The integrated pest management, different areas are going to have different methods because you're going to have different organisms potentially living there. So you kind of can't use an overriding umbrella type system. You have to individually target, and that could be a disadvantage. And initially the costs are higher. So again, with a lot of this stuff, the initial capital costs to start these programs up are high. Once you get the programs up and running, it actually reduces costs. But again, having that money up front sometimes is a problem for farmers. All right, so that's talking about integrated pest management and pest control. Now we'll move on to how we can produce food more sustainably. So we can produce food more sustainably by using resources more efficiently, sharply decreasing the harmful environmental effects of industrialized food production, and eliminating government subsidies that promote such harmful impacts. So again, we have government subsidies that help support these large industrialized farms. Well, maybe we should eliminate those and maybe give subsidies to farms that are going to use more traditional low input agriculture techniques. And one of those techniques is about conserving topsoil. So we spoke about how industrialized agriculture tends to lead to erosion and leads to the losing of the fertility of your topsoil. So we need to conserve that topsoil. So we do that by something called soil conservation, and there are a bunch of different ways that we can do that. I'll show you some pictures of these in just a second, but they involve terracing, something called contour planting, something called strip cropping with cover crop, alley cropping, which is agroforestry, windbreaks or shelter belts, and conservation tillage farming. And again, we want to identify those erosion hotspots. So this is what we're looking at. You'll notice A here on the upper left. A is an example of terracing. You can go back thousands of years and take a look. The Romans, the Greeks actually did this. By terracing, you make different layers and a downslope that are flat. Those flattened layers reduce erosion because, again, erosion is going to be more prominent on a slope. So if you have a flatter area, as rain or wind comes down, it tends to not erode as much. So this is one of the ways to conserve topsoil. B is something known as contour planting and strip cropping. And what you'll notice here is there are strips of plants. So you have a strip of plant here, and the contour plowing actually plows with the contour of the ground. So you'll notice it when it curves like this, it's because it's on a hill. So then they'll contour around the hill and plow, and then you'll strip crop, meaning you'll just put crops in a strip, then you'll have no crops, then a strip of crops, then no crops, and that can conserve topsoil. C is called intercropping. This is your polyculture, right? Intercropping means different crops grown together. So you notice we have one crop here, a different crop here, different crops on the outside. That can conserve topsoil. And then windbreaks between fields. You'll notice, and they're not necessarily unnatural windbreaks like fences. You can put these forests, right, or shrubs along the fields here, right? And this helps conserve topsoil, because as wind blows and starts to erode the topsoil, the wind hits the windbreaks, right, those trees or those shrubs, and the wind dies down. That allows the topsoil that was being blown away to settle back to the ground, and then you conserve your topsoil in that area, and that topsoil isn't blown away. So you get the topsoil, and you keep the fertility of the soil. So these are just a couple of ways. Understand these 4 types of farming techniques that are used to conserve topsoil. And again, that's really one of the first parts of trying to farm in a more sustainable way. Again, we want to restore that soil fertility if we have lost it. So we can do that with organic fertilizer, again, animal manure, green manure, and compost. We can manufacture inorganic fertilizers like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, okay? And that can help restore the soil fertility, but again, you don't want to use it that much. We can use something called biochar. And then we can use crop rotation, right? Crop rotation is you grow a crop in a field, then you let that field rest for a season. You grow the crop in another field, then you let that field rest for a season. And as the field rests, it obviously, the soil fertility is increased by either some of these natural or unnatural ways that we can do it. In addition, we want to reduce that soil salinization and that desertification, right? We spoke about this. Soil salinization occurs when you irrigate too much, and then salts are built up in the soil, which ends up rendering the soil useless. And then desertification is when an area actually turns into a desert. So soil salinization, unfortunately, the solutions are very costly. For desertification, to reduce it, we want to reduce population growth, overgrazing, deforestation, and we want to reduce the destructive forms of planting, irrigation, and mining. We want to plant trees that anchor topsoil. That's important because the roots of many trees will anchor the topsoil and hold it together. You don't want that topsoil blowing away because that can lead to these problems. So, solutions for soil salinization, prevention, and cleanup. Again, understand this. This is when too much salt is built up because of irrigation. So how can we prevent it? Number 1, reduce irrigation. Number 2, use more efficient irrigation methods. And number 3, switch to salt-tolerant crops that can actually handle a soil that has become more salty. And you'll notice these irrigation methods here. These are just more natural or more efficient ways than just spraying water. Here you have a pipe that water kind of trickles out from underneath the ground and just gives the plants the just right amount of water that it needs, instead of just inundating the plants with water. That obviously leads to that soil salinization. So more efficient irrigation methods could help prevent that. The problem is the cleanup when you do get soil that is too salty is very expensive. What can you do? You can flush the soil, but that means flush it with fresh water. Flush it in to try to get the salts out, but that's expensive and not that efficient. You can stop growing crops for 2 to 5 years on that part of land. That can work, but obviously if you're a farmer looking for money, 2 to 5 years of not growing crops not going to help your bottom line. And you can install underground drainage systems. So again, soil salinization is because the soil gets waterlogged, and then as the water evaporates, the salts are left behind. If you install underground drainage systems, well then if you irrigate too much, instead of the soil getting waterlogged, that water will drain away, and that will reduce the soil salinization in the area. But again, these are expensive methods. So really what you want to do is just reduce that irrigation or use more efficient irrigation methods to help reduce that soil salinization. All right, so how now can we produce and consume meat and dairy products more sustainably? So again, we're working through the 3 types of food production here. So we can shift from less efficient forms of animal protein to more efficient. So for instance, pork and poultry are more efficient than beef, meaning you get more calorie intake, more energy per unit of pork or poultry than you do per unit of beef. Okay, so we should potentially eat more pork and poultry. We reduce or eliminate our meat intake, kind of talking about that. Insects are another source of protein. Okay, now this disgusts me, but in many cultures, they eat insects like grasshoppers, right? They're actually a great source of protein that can actually help you survive and flourish. I'm not sure I want to start eating insects, but again, that's an alternative. India's dairy industry uses crop residues such as rice straws and corn stalks. This is to feed their cattle, and this actually saves energy and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe instead of creating all those monoculture to create all that grain to feed the animals, maybe just use the crop leftovers to feed them, and then that will save energy and reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. This is really an interesting chart here. This is showing the amount of feed. So this is the amount of feed, okay, again, that we need to feed the animals to produce 1,000 calories of meat for human consumption. So again, look at beef, how inefficient it is. You need the amount of feed required. You need over 36,000 calories of feed to feed the beef, to feed the cattle, to produce 1,000 worth of calories for human consumption. So you'll notice pork, poultry, eggs, and dairy decrease that dramatically. So that's why this chart is basically the reason why we should consume more pork and poultry and not beef, is because it's a lot. There's a lot less energy input needed to get an energy output. For beef, you got to put a lot of energy in to get a little energy out. Pork, poultry, eggs, dairy, you got to put less input in to get that same output. So again, it's just a more efficient way to feed people. We need to practice more sustainable aquaculture, all right? So again, working through the three feed food production types here. An Aquaculture Stewardship Council has been developed to basically develop for sustainability standards. It's certified 4.6% of the world's aquaculture operations. So unfortunately, many more are not certified. Open ocean aquaculture can help produce it more sustainably, the aquaculture, because again, when you're closer to the coast, you may be destroying wetlands, mangrove forests, things like that. So do it in the open ocean. Recirculating aquaculture, which is when the water is continually recycled, that can help with the disease issue. And we want polyaquaculture, just like we want polyculture when it comes to plants. What's polyaquaculture? Different fish all living in the same area, being farmed. So you don't just want salmon in that pool, right? That aquaculture pool. Maybe you want salmon, maybe you want trout, maybe you want sea bass. Again, polyaquaculture, you want many more creatures, not just one. So practice more sustainable aquaculture solutions, protect those mangrove forests and estuaries, improve the management of the wastes, reduce escape of aquaculture species into the wild. So that's an issue, because when they escape, they're not in many ways the same species as the wild ones, so that can cause some issues. Set up self-sustaining polyaquaculture systems that combine aquatic plants, fish, and shellfish, and again, certify sustainable forms of aquaculture so that you know what you're buying at the store. Just going to want to buy the ones that are certified as being sustainable. So again, this shift to a more sustainable food production in general needs to be created. Components of that sustainable agriculture, again, so now we're going to kind of go back and go through this a little bit more. You want to rely more on the organic polyculture. Again, multiple crops, less on the conventional monoculture, which is one crop. You want to grow perennial crops. You want to rely more on renewable energy. You want to tailor fertilizers to different soil conditions to minimize runoff. And you want to irrigate more efficiently so we don't have those issues with soil salinization. All right, so here we go. More sustainable food production solutions. More high-yield polyculture, more organic fertilizers, biological pest controls. We want more of that integrated pest management, more efficient irrigation, more perennial crops, crop rotation, more water-efficient crops. We want to do soil conservation, and we want to provide subsidies for sustainable farming. What do we want less of? Soil erosion, soil salinization, water pollution, aquifer depletion. We want less overgrazing and overfishing. We want less loss of biodiversity and agro-biodiversity. We want less fossil fuel use, less greenhouse gas emissions, and less subsidies for unsustainable farming. So what can you do? Well, once again, eat less meat, no meat, or organically certified meat. Choose sustainably produced herbivorous fish, not fish that eat other fish. Buy organic farming to grow some of your food, or use organic farming to grow some of your own food. Buy certified organic food, eat locally grown food, compost your food waste, and try to cut your food waste as well. These are all ways that we can shift to a more sustainable food production. All right, so how can we improve food security? Again, the whole idea of this food production in the environment, this industrialized food production, was to help improve food security, meaning people in impoverished nations, or even in the United States, that don't have enough food, how can we improve that? So again, the green revolutions we thought was the way to do it, right? With all this high input fertilizer, monoculture, we got all these crops, lots of yield. But again, now we're finding out years later that it's not as good as we thought. So how can we improve food security without using that high input industrialized agriculture? Well, government policies have controlled food prices and provided subsidies. So for instance, New Zealand and Brazil have ended farm subsidies successfully. All right. And this again has allowed more of those traditional farms to pop up. Government and private programs that target poverty can improve food security. So again, low interest loans, immunizations, and vitamins for children can help as well. So we can grow and buy more food locally and cut food waste. This can help, right? Community-supported agriculture. People buy a share of a local farmer's crop, receive a box of produce on a regular basis during the growing season, and this supports local economies and farm families. So this is a way to do it. Much of our food waste occurs in restaurants, homes, and supermarkets. 30 to 40% of the food supply thrown away each year. So this is another way that we can help use more sustainable agriculture, because maybe we don't need all this huge food yield, right? If we're throwing away 40% of our food supply, if we just don't throw that away, that would reduce the amount of food that we need initially, and then that might reduce the need for these high input industrialized agriculture and meat production and aquaculture type farms, because again, if we don't throw out this much food, well, there'll be more food around, right? So you won't have to produce more food. So that could be something we can do. What is this here? Again, just a picture of a community garden. Again, this is one of those ways, and you see this. I know at my own shop, right, where I shop, there is a whole section now in the produce department of locally grown foods. Yes, it is a little bit more expensive than the industrialized agriculture food, the high input, the rest of the supermarket. They are a little bit more pricey, but again, the price is not that much more, and that price is including the environmental issues, right? So it is kind of that full cost pricing, and therefore that's kind of where we need to go, right? We need to buy it, even though it costs a couple of more bucks. It definitely helps with the cutting and the buying locally, cutting that food waste, and help reduce the need for that industrialized food production. Some of the trade-offs, all right, challenges, demand side, you have a growing population, people moving up the food chain, turning food into biofuel. So again, all these issues are challenges to buy food locally and cut food waste, because you really kind of need the industrialized agriculture and food production because of so much demand. On the supply side, though, you're having issues, soil erosion, depletion of aquifers, stagnant grain yields, and rising temperatures are actually hurting the yields. So again, we have these challenges on both sides, and in a way, we have to kind of figure out how to deal with both of them. So here are some solutions on the demand side. Stabilize the population. Obviously, we talked about that a few chapters ago. That could happen. That could help. Eradicate poverty. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it definitely can help. We need to eradicate poverty. We need to reduce excessive meat consumption, and we need to eliminate biofuel subsidies, meaning Don't give farms subsidies to produce rows and rows of corn for ethanol. We want to eliminate those subsidies. So on the supply side, we can conserve soil with those methods we spoke about. We can use more water more efficiently in our irrigation. We can find ways to increase yields naturally. And of course, we can stabilize the climate, which will help with the climate control and the global warming. All right, so that's pretty much the end of this chapter 12. I know it was rather long, food production and the environment. Just a couple of slides left here talking about the big ideas of the chapter. About 795 million people have health problems because they do not get enough to eat. 2.1 billion people face health problems from eating too much, actually, believe it or not. Modern industrialized agriculture has a greater harmful impact on the environment than any other human activity. Again, 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from modern industrialized agriculture and meat production. So think about that, okay? Again, we thought this was going to be the saving grace. We're finding years later that unfortunately it's really having harmful impacts on the environment. So we need to find more sustainable forms of food production. This greatly reduces the harmful environmental impacts of industrialized food production systems. Again, we want that low input, more traditional style of food production. So tying it all together, growing power and sustainability. Again, this is a transition to a more sustainable food production. Rely on solar energy, conserve your topsoil, return crop residues and animal waste to the soil to help with that soil fertility. Rely on a greater variety of crops and animal strains. Again, not monoculture. We want polyculture. And there it is. Use polyculture and integrated pest management to control those pests. All right, so that's the end, guys, of Chapter 12, Food Production and the Environment. And as always, thanks for listening.